welcome again, everyone. On behalf of Rattlestick and this week's edition of our virtual salon, I want to welcome everyone to the conversation of the impact of COVID-19 on the environment. We will go through a very fascinating conversation with a wonderful group of people whose bios will be posted in the chat, and you may have seen on the information regarding today's virtual salon. As we go through the conversation, we encourage you to read or to contribute to the chat column through the Zoom chat, which will be for questions to each other, but also questions for our panelists, which we'll be taking toward the end of the conversation. The panelists may also be asking us, and you'll find things posted in the chat box as well, information that they'd like to share with you, so watch for that as well. But we are honored and delighted to start with an excerpt from Miranda Rose Hall's A Play for the Living in the Time of Extinction, which will be read for us by the activist and actress Kyra Sedgwick. Kyra.
Thank you. Okay, so this is like my ad hoc version of the creation of Earth and its past extinctions, according to Western science, so that I can, like, you know, get in the zone. Okay? Okay. Once upon a time, there was no space. And then all of a sudden, there's a lot of space. The Big Bang. And out of the space comes gas and dust. And the gas and dust become stars. And one star in particular forms a very big star, the sun. More dust and gas become meteorites and rocks, and they collide and become Earth. And at this point, the Earth is neither happy nor unhappy. It is rock. And out of the rock comes gas. And the gas cools and becomes water. And it rains. Can you believe it? It rains. Can I get some applause for the rain, please? Thank you. So this is a major event. And the water flows all over the Earth. And so life begins to form. Very small life, single cells. And the Earth basically hangs out like this for like billions of years until some bacteria form and somehow invent photosynthesis, which means that they invent oxygen. And this is a big deal. So more things happen, and somehow single cell organisms start to live collectively, start to have like their own hippie communes, and these hippie commune cells start to form like co-op charter mission and turn themselves into animals, like super basic animals who don't even hunt. They just float around in the water and let all of their food come to them. Jealous. But then some carbon gets up into some business in the Appalachian Mountains and causes a brief yet lethal tiny little ice age, which we call mass extinction number 1. So let's try something. Could you all really just like, could everyone make some like floaty critter animals? Okay, so we are critters, and let's see some ice age. It's getting colder, it's getting colder, it's getting colder, and we're dead. And actually, if Pino and Jody and Faith and Scott, you randomly survive, congratulations. So let's see those critter hands. Great. Okay, and even though you're like thousands of miles apart, you pave the way for a new burst of life. Can I get a burst? Can we give them a round of applause, please?
Kyra, thank you very much for that. And Miranda, thank you very much for that beautiful play as well. It's a great opening given that what we're living through now and the many similarities and changes to science and medicine and health, food safety and energy and. But there does seem to be one underlying theme that which we will continue to talk about through this. That I'd like to start with our first panelist, Peggy, who is the co-founder and ED of We Act for Environmental Justice. Peggy, could you just describe environmental justice for us and kick us off?
Sure. Environmental justice is a movement to address the environmental racism that our communities of color, tribal communities have borne over the last decades. Certainly, we have a disparate amount of pollution in our communities. Our communities are intentionally targeted for pollution and for all the unwanted consumer benefits and dregs of consumerism. And so we understand that we also do not have access to environmental decision-making, to elite commissions and advisory boards that are making decisions that affect all of our lives, and that we are on a continuum of racism that goes from housing segregation to education segregation to police brutality to banking redlining. It's a continuum of racism that affects all sectors of our lives. And so as environmental justice advocates, we understand that environmental exposure contributes to the disparate amount of health disparities, the escalating health disparities that we continue to see, which is one of the reasons that we've seen such a high percentage of Black and people of color dying from COVID. And now we know from the Harvard study that air pollution and people living in air polluted communities are at higher risk of mortality from COVID-19. So again, environmental justice, environmental racism is about that continuum of racism that we experience in all aspects of our lives in our communities.
It's as broad as that happens to be, and deeply appealing. Dan, you have the pleasure of, for the city, as the Chief Climate Policy Advisor, and the OneNYC Director for the Mayor's Office, of getting to deal with all of this. Could you help us understand a little about your role around Superstorm Sandy and how that is paralleled with this new superstorm we happen to have, which is COVID-19?
Yeah, thank you, Robert, and thanks for having me here today. It's a pleasure to share the stage here. It's unfortunate. I think Peggy just alluded to this. What we are living through right now with COVID can, in some ways, almost be thought of as a scary dry run for what's going to happen with climate. We're seeing the disparate impacts hitting our communities. We're seeing the disruptions to lives and livelihoods, to our sense of community in so many ways. And, it's what we're going to see more of and worse of as our climate crisis continues to unfold. We've seen it play out here in New York City in a climate context already with Hurricane Sandy. We see it when there are heat waves in New York City. Heat waves kill more New Yorkers than any other natural hazard. And so we, as we think about what these challenges are and how they are interrelated, it's helpful not to think of climate as some niche environmental problem. It really is this broad-based social challenge that we face. And it's so important to think about the social equity, the social justice, the racial justice components of doing that. As we are doing our work here in New York City, under the banner of OneNYC, which is the city's long-term strategic plan, we've tried to take all of this into account and really understand the threats and the vulnerabilities that we face from a range of different challenges, but most notably understanding how we're going to confront our climate crisis and making sure that we are moving as quickly as we can to decarbonize our economy, to prepare for the threats that we're going to see, whether it's more coastal storms, more sea level rise, heat, but to think more broadly about what the impacts are, because when those things happen, when those physical impacts happen, the heat, the sea level rise, the storms, the rain, it spills over into the social dimension very quickly. And we see the disparate impacts, whether it was in Hurricane Sandy along the Rockaway Peninsula, the NYCHA and public housing communities hit so much harder than other communities on the same peninsula. And so it's important for us to make sure that we are promoting equity in how we are pursuing these programs, and whether that means planting, all the heat mitigation work that the city is doing and expanding right now in this COVID moment, and making sure that is directed into communities of color, poorer communities that face higher heat vulnerability, or it comes through in our coastal protection plans and other protections that we're doing. And it also has to come through in the ways in which we are pursuing more solar and wind and hydropower and all the things that we need to decarbonize our electricity grid. And then thinking even broadly about the plans on the technical things we need to do to address climate change, the clean energy, but also thinking about the systemic finance and how we are continuing to prop up the fossil fuel industry with investment and finance, which is why we're divesting our pension funds from fossil fuels. And all of it has to continue to promote the environmental justice that we need to see in our communities. And this moment in COVID, I think, is really, it's so important to think of this as one of our last best chances in order to get the investment we need in clean energy, in the job creation for climate resilience and clean energy and resilient infrastructure and the environmental justice that we need to see. This is a moment when we are going to be spending a lot of money, and there's still more talk of stimulus out of Washington. We need to make sure that we're thinking of this as a green recovery, and making sure that we are taking this moment, this last best choice that we have to choose a better future, to emerge stronger, to make sure that we are addressing the historic environmental injustices that we've seen and getting ourselves to a better future. And I think we've seen a glimpse of what that looks like with fewer cars on the road and cleaner air. And it's given us a glimpse of that there is a better future out there. And I think we need to choose that moment right now.
I think it's a critical, to your point, that last best chance is such a beautiful way of putting it, because we have seen this. And you talk about the breadth of the community involvement and the different levels and the forms and type. Whitney, who's joining us, she's the principal and the head of Beyond Diversity at the Raben Group. You were telling me how you would approach this and how you need to include people. Could you expound upon Dan's points?
Sure. And so thank you again for letting me join. A couple of things. One, I think really going to both Peggy and Dan's point is, how is the community actually involved in every piece of the puzzle at every step? Because that is often the place where things have fallen down, right? When Peggy's talking about, like, how do we get on boards? How do we get, to be in the seats of power? That is the place where these communities need to be. They need to be in those seats of power, or create a process by which the community voice becomes the voice that then decides what happens, right? So for me, in thinking about this work, both on, racism, on environmental injustice, right? It's all about who has power, who is wielding power, and then where do you cede power to the communities that actually need it, who know what the problems are, but also know what the solutions are. And so for me, when I think about this work, it's really thinking about all those little places, right, where people make decisions, small ones to large ones, and where is the community in helping to both make that decision and then implement it? Because that's often where we've fallen down, and that goes to the system level, right, which is like, we have a system of racism, right? It's not just like a pocket of it or a small dip, it is a system that we actually have to tackle at multiple levels, right? It's both how, government works, it's how the private sector works, it's how the economy works, right? Are we actually tackling all of those systems to really unearth the level of oppression that has happened, especially for people of color and tribal communities? Or are we going to just sort of do the same thing, but hoping for a different outcome, right? And that's not going to work, right? And then especially not going to work now because you can see what happens in the American system where we still rely on individualism and not collectivism in just watching what is happening with COVID right now.
It's triggering a perfect question right into Elena, who is the Director of Research at PSE Healthy Energy. And Elena and we had an earlier conversation around collectivism and collective responses and how we're addressing, and we'll let Elena tell us, but along the lines of we're collectively addressing COVID and how that can collectively address other scientific situations, including the environment.
I mean, I think I'm going to echo many of the sort of same sentiments that we've all talked about here, but in order for us to actually tackle this, we have to collectively, and by collectively I mean not just across all of our communities, but across the entire world, organize how we respond to COVID. So that means pumping money into research. That means rapidly translating the science and our understanding of how this works to communities, to local governments, to federal governments, to communicating across all of these different levels, all of these institutions, and working collectively to solve this problem. And honestly, so far, I don't think we're doing the best job. We can see that some governments are responding to this well, and in other places we see, across the United States, COVID is taking off. But hopefully there are lessons learned here about how we can cooperate on both research efforts and on sharing that science in terms of how we address things like climate change. And so it's a slightly slower moving problem, but simultaneously it's going to take the same collective effort. The burdens are going to fall on these same communities that are vulnerable to COVID, that are vulnerable to pollution, are going to be the most impacted. And again, not just in the United States, but on this really global scale. The people who have emitted the most carbon and the richest, whitest countries are not the ones who are going to bear the heaviest brunt of climate change. And so we have to make sure that all of the science and all the research that we do not only protects those richest countries, but is translated as well. I think one interesting sort of concept here is also thinking about science and trusted messengers. So one of the things that we're sort of grappling with in COVID is that we have to trust our doctors, we have to trust medicine in a very rapidly evolving scientific field. And so we're still learning how COVID is getting transmitted. We're still learning, we're still trying to do research on how to develop vaccines and protect populations. And that science is changing. And so you both have to trust the scientists and trust the researchers, but be willing to take in new information and rapidly adapt. And I think that's actually true for science too. Unfortunately, we've seen this undermining of climate scientists for decades. And this is the same thing with public health, same thing with smoking. But we have to figure out how to both trust and adapt that science and be able to change our policies and change how we respond as new information is coming in, whether that's in COVID or whether that's in climate science.
One of the trust situation, the trust issue that we're all facing, a lot of people are overwhelmed by it. And one of the things that Rattlestick and other artists do on our behalf is learn, translate, try and find a way to work with whatever the world is throwing at them. Pino, you as the executive director and founder of the EcoArt Project and Rebound, work with a collective of artists who are trying to make sense of everything we're talking about here. Could you comment on what you're seeing on the streets, literally?
Sure. I'll give a quick introduction before about what we do with our organization, EcoArt Project, and what we are experiencing and everybody is seeing on the street, and the street art, how is reacting to all the last events that happen all over the US. So since 2010, I worked on the art side of sustainability and environmental space through the nonprofit EcoArtProject.org. And I believe the website is maybe below into the chat, or I'll put it after. And the mission is to use work of artists and designers to give a voice to everyone concerned about climate change and environmental issues, including scientists. And we welcome creative professionals in all fields, so visual arts, performing arts, design, and etc. And for whom the environment is expressed in their concept, so in their work, in their message. So the core of our platform is the global showcase, which represents the work over 1,000 artists as today. So if you are an artist or a designer, we also invite you to submit your work for publication, and then we will notify you whenever we have upcoming events, competitions, or awards and prizes. So all the experience that we have accumulating through the past years bring us to observe what's going on today on the streets and how artists reacted. And there's been a burst and an explosion of just spontaneous action of street artists all over Broadway, especially in Soho. I don't know if you had a chance to walk around and see all the boarded panels of the stores that have been paneled up. And tons of stores ran actually out of business, probably for good. And there is tons of real estate that now, as a result, is empty and will be there sitting empty for a while until they find a new tenant. So that's a big real estate issue right now of empty spaces. So what we are putting together very quickly is an initiative called Rebound NYC. And the objective is to partner with real estate owners or tenants and to get assigned spaces that we can then assign to artists in a coordinated manner and have street art happening in an organized way. So what's going on today is it's very spontaneous. Artists are painting the panels, but then also the stores are taking them away or painting them on top because they don't like it. So it's becoming uncontrolled, and it's very interesting in a way, but it's also, it's not leveraged at how it could be leveraged. Yeah, so we're creating a call for artists, an invitation for artists, and then we will activate through an initiative, which is a creative placemaking initiative that through creating several points of art events on the street will generate traffic, pedestrian traffic. And the idea is that traffic generates economy. So people will hang out again, socially distanced when we have to, and restaurants will be happy to have people around their restaurants again, instead of you just don't know what to do today. There's nothing going on in the city, like in terms of entertainment or Broadway or movie theater or sport events or anything. So people need something that brings them out in a safe place.
That fortunately is a lot of what Dan gets to manage with the rebuild and the conversation. As we're approaching this a little bit from both science and art, the thought of rebuilding New York, so that is, I think someone on your team had said magical. Let's reinvent the magic, or let's re-highlight the magic that is New York, so that as we come through the COVID pandemic, we have a city that is even stronger and better. Some of the other initiatives, could you tell us a little more about those as well, Dan?
Well, you know, we as a city have been through a ton, and like whether you look back just over the last 20 years with 9/11 and the Great Recession and Sandy, and you know, you could go on and on. We've gone through suffering, and we've found ways to come through it as a stronger city at the end of it. And I find that hope that I certainly feel that we will find our way through this. And it has not been positive. It's not been a great experience, but the city will be back, but it'll be different. And I think it always comes through having learned a new set of lessons. And it's so important that we need to figure out where that magic is going to come from. And it's, the soul of New York City comes through from our cultural institutions, our community organizations, the whole arts and media and entertainment. And so it's going to be different until, you know, we find our way to the other end of a pandemic for sure. And, you know, indoor spaces and Broadway and all of that is going to be really hard to bring back. But I think it's really important that we find ways to support and think about whether it's like the utilization of our street space and the open restaurants plans, the open streets plans that get people out and utilizing and interacting with their neighborhood in a different way, I think will bear a lot of really positive fruit at the end of this as more people are thinking about, you know, bicycle transportation and, you know, just different ways to engage with the street. And I think the, you know, that part of it, I think, is something that is going to take hold now. And I have a feeling that it won't shut itself off. I think it's going to be really, there's gonna be a lot of strong pressure to keep a lot of that sort of street life and community, and you can use all of that street space, you know, in the ways that we're doing now for restaurants and transportation and culture. I think there's really a lot of interesting things that are going to happen there, and that may be one of the things that we come out of this in a very different way.
Elena, you had been telling us about some of your research. It's slightly broader than New York, but also is New York specific. Could you share some of the work you're doing, which just reinforces this on a broader level?
Reinforces what specifically?
How it's beyond New York City. That what wonderful that Dan and the team or the city are doing. You were talking about some energy situation and some of the research you're doing around that, and wind and et cetera, and the like. That just goes beyond our own city walls.
Yeah, I mean, I think as we're looking at COVID recovery, so there's, from like an environmental standpoint, I think we're seeing a couple things happening right now. We've actually seen this on our own. We have a set of air monitors out in Richmond, California, which is north of here, and it's a community of color that has experienced numerous environmental burdens for decades and has a long history of working in the environmental justice space. It is refineries and traffic and all sorts of things. And so we're collecting data on particulate matter and ozone and NOx, which is a precursor for ozone and particulate matter formation, which cause cardiovascular and respiratory disease. And we happen to have monitors out right during lockdown. And so we saw a drop in particulate matter and in ozone concentrations. And weirdly, a slight uptick in ozone, which has to do with complicated atmospheric chemistry. So there's this, I think broadly, we're seeing across the United States and the world something like a drop of maybe 15-17% in carbon dioxide emissions. But those emissions are still high enough that atmospheric concentrations are increasing. And we're seeing these temporary improvements in air quality and things like that, which are important. But in order to make any of those last, we have to make sure that we continue to invest in clean energy technologies and in transitions. And again, we're facing a potential recession. And there's a couple of different ways that this can pan out. One of these is that we stop investing in things. There's not that much money. We're seeing, and we're doing some work in Nevada right now. All of their budget comes from casinos. No one's going to casinos. How are they going to invest in clean energy? They don't have any funding. And so all of these states, everyone's facing budget shortfalls. So there's this risk of not being able to invest in these clean energy technologies and these things that we need to mitigate climate change moving forward. At the same time, it's a giant opportunity. So if we do pump everything into something effectively like a Green New Deal, as Daniel said, this is our last best chance to actually fight this. And so there needs to be, I think, a strong effort on this like local, state, federal, and worldwide level to really invest in a transition, both for climate in the long term and to help our economy recover in the short term. Yeah.
You know, Robert, you know, what I'm thinking about is, we know Richmond, California. We know Cancer Alley. We know Hunts Point. We know where all of these hotspots are, yet we've done nothing. and all of a sudden everyone is woke. Where was everybody a year ago, 10 years ago, or 20 years ago? And when we knew that the Clean Air Act was not working and that we should be focused on these hotspots and figure out why it's not working and address it. So it's heartening that everyone is waking up, but it's also extremely frustrating because we've known about these issues for decades. So I'd like to ask people on this, on this Zoom, why are you just waking up? Why is it that suddenly we can make all of these changes happen, or certainly talk about change happening within weeks, when we've known for decades what the problems are and have not even thought a minute about addressing them? So that's the question I would like to hear answered.
Can I actually broadly build on that, which is a lot of people are talking about it right now and talking about, again, structural racism and how that's affecting the environment and how that's affecting COVID. We don't know if that's going to translate into action yet. And so it sounds good. Everything everyone has been saying this last couple of weeks sounds good. And the proof is in the pudding, right?
You know, a couple of months ago, I'm on the board of a green group. And for the first time, I was able to get the board members to go on a toxic tour. And we took them to Richmond because we were having the board meeting in California. And people were astounded. We were outside of an elementary school where, you know, an oil refinery was right in sight, and the emissions and the smells were absolutely incredible. And these board members couldn't even believe it. You know, you can read about these things, but you really have to go and see it, and really feel it, to really feel the inhumanity that has been advancing all these years. So I'm now working with Dan Zarrilli. We've got an environmental justice advisory group. We've been able to develop 2 environmental justice pieces of legislation at the City Council in the last couple of years. So we now have a task force on environmental justice. We are working now to identify every environmental justice community in New York City and what their concerns are, and to develop an interagency task force, which is going to begin to develop ways to address it. And that's the kind of change and action that we need going on in every city in this country. And, you know, I hope, Dan, that, you know, a lot of us can work and, you know, put these models out there for other groups to begin to address. In New Jersey, for instance, they have a bill pending, finally, on cumulative impact. And, you know, when you're impacted by disproportionate exposure, you also have to understand the cumulative exposure. So when we permit facilities, so we'll permit, you know, one facility by facility, or, you know, something around air or water or solid waste, but we never look at the cumulative impact of all of those facilities in one small community. And in New Jersey, they're beginning, they certainly have put forward a bill to begin to address that. And that would be, I believe, the first in the nation. And so again, we've got to be proactive. We've got to look at the problems and begin to, you know, address some solutions there, create some solutions.
And actually, again, to build on that, like, we've looked at power plants across New Jersey, and they are disproportionately I mean, this is not a surprise to anyone who's ever thought about this before, but they're disproportionately located in low-income and minority communities, like hands down. In New York, we've looked at a bunch of the peaker power plants. These are plants that come on like 5% of the time to meet peak summer demand, often on hot days with bad ozone. These things are often burning diesel oil with old emission controls, and thankfully there's some new regulations to start phasing them out. But, you know, there's a handful of plants up in the Bronx, for example, Hellgate and Harlem River Yard. And these are in areas that we actually looked at the cumulative environmental health and demographic burdens of the populations living nearby. And, you know, these are some of the most heavily impacted communities in the area. And individually, some of these plants are less dirty than a couple of the other ones, but you have plant after facility after being on top of in communities that also have so many cumulative vulnerabilities as well. So this is a true enrichment. It's, again, it's all over the place.
And what I'll say is we're talking sort of in decadal scales, but I think we need to talk in generational ones, right? This isn't a problem that just started, right? Like when the Clean Water or Clean Air Act came into place, this is like 401 years of oppression, right? Like, let's be clear about what we're really talking about, which is like, we have continued to create and perpetuate systems that continue to oppress a group of people, right? And we continually make choices around that, right? And so, yes, the power plant, but it is so indicative of all the other pieces that intersect with one's life. Like the environment is obviously one, but it's also access to arts. It's access to, you know, healthcare. It's access to everything, right? It's everything.
Yeah.
And we need to really think about this at like a really big, audacious scale, because that is the only way that this stuff will actually really change. Like, I fully agree with Peggy. We got to start like at the local issue to tackle these things, like, so that people know and people have access to like saying like, do not put that here. But it also means that then the people who haven't been impacted need to be prepared to be impacted in a way that you haven't, and you've had the privilege of not being impacted, right? And to acknowledge that privilege and then make a different choice. And this goes to like education, healthcare, right? Everything. And so while my heart will always be in environmental work, like this is everything. This is every choice you make, every time you do anything.
Yeah. And Robert, you know, I'd like to talk a little about the frontline workers. You know, we're now reading that workers who have died, their family is getting, you know, handed a huge hospital bill. We're finding that these workers who we're asking to be in these hospitals or chicken plants or meat plants out in the Midwest and put their lives on the line, and when they get sick, they may not have insurance. No one's taking care of them or their families, yet we're insisting that they go to work. And so the worker equity here is just not happening. And Dan, I hope the city is really focusing on this with the investment in the COVID issues, because it's just not right. It's just like the 911 responders who we had to spend, what, 10, 20 years before Congress would give the investment and the money to help them with health care and other kinds of insurance issues. So we now have the same thing with this whole group of workers, and it just is not fair or equitable. And we couldn't, you know, we would have no healthcare system without them right now.
One of the conversations we had, one of this virtual salon a few months ago now, was around the essential workers, and in particular, how we're treating them and the humanity that these people have stepped up. And there are not necessarily, even though we might appreciate people now, we're not necessarily going to continue that appreciation. And what does that mean toward our own humanity associated with this? And all the questions we're asking here around equality across the board. Whitney, you had tossed out a great word, audacious. A presumptive Democratic candidate today announced a $2 trillion environmental study, including environmental justice and the like. Is that audacious enough?
Maybe getting there, but we gotta tackle a lot of things. Like, I think it's a good start, right? It's like probably the most audacious we've had to date. Does it fully capture, you know, everything? Not sure. Haven't had a chance to like, you know, get in and read it yet. But that's the scale at which we need to think, right? That is the place, right? Like, what are we doing in power plants and oceans and fish in all of the places, right, where environment has some relative, you know, impact on our lives, which is everything. So yeah, we need to think at the like half, if not the entire GDP of the country. Like that's the scale at which we actually need to be audacious. And I'll even push a little further, which is we need to go from just like thinking about a different system to thinking about true liberation, right? Which is a different thing, right? This is not just like, let's tinker with the system anymore. Like, I don't think that is entirely possible. I think we need to think about what does an entirely different system need to look like to actually achieve the kind of liberation that people need.
Now, a lot of people are talking about certainly reparations, and I would really love to hear some of the other folks here, respond to that concept. The fact that the country was built on free slave labor, and what are the descendants of those slaves do? Because as we can see, the whole continuum of racism, which has oppressed communities of color all of these hundreds of years, what do those communities do? And I'd love to hear any response anyone here has to make.
Would anyone on the panel like to comment on Peggy's? And while you're thinking about that, a reminder to everyone in the chat room that you should also be sending in your questions, because we'll open it up for panelists or questions from the audience shortly. But since I said that and said it slowly enough to buy anyone else time to come up with an answer, I'll turn it back to the panelists.
Yeah, the only thing I think I would add to that is, I think, Peggy, you may know pieces of this. The mayor announced a Racial Equity and Justice Commission, and I'm probably using the exact wrong words on that is meant to be something akin to the South African Truth and Reconciliation model, to really, as a city, have this conversation. I don't know, obviously I don't know what you think about that, or whether you've been asked to participate in some way, but I know that's something that's clearly on the mayor's mind and on the First Lady's mind, around really starting that conversation and thinking about what it really means to confront our past and do things differently going forward. So that is something that the city is doing right now. I obviously don't know where it's going to land and what it's going to result in, but I think it's a positive step to really be able to say we're going to have that conversation and just set the table, right, so that we can actually have a truthful and honest, confronting of the past, so that we know how to do things different in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. If you don't acknowledge a problem, you really can't begin to truly address it.
Yes.
I also, it makes me think of something that, Elena, you mentioned a little earlier around this issue of trust and who to believe. And like in the climate space, there's a different angle to this trust question, which is misinformation and purposeful disinformation that comes through from the fossil fuel interests that are making those choices in some cases to put those power plants and peakers in certain places, and then to deny that the impacts are there. Smoking doesn't hurt you. Fossil fuels aren't causing climate change. And I wonder how you might think about the trust issue there. And I also think there's an interesting conversation, particularly in this setting, around how art and culture and trusted voices can come out of different spaces to really contextualize these issues in a new way. And the role of art and public art and cultural institutions to shine a deeper spotlight on some of these contradictions and misinformation that we've seen, particularly from the fossil fuel industry.
And a quick just addendum on that. Also, I think trust on something that Peggy said earlier about what communities are experiencing. And you said that, people have to go to Richmond to see like what's actually happening there. But trusting the frontline communities about what they're experiencing and trusting those voices, I think is part of that continuum. Trusting the scientists, trusting the communities.
I would like to add something to Dan's observation about the role of artists and how they interpret the messages for the environment, and how actually how really fundamental can be their help in delivering messages in a creative way. We all know that all the subject of climate change, on the subject of climate change, modern scientists have been often called out for not sounding an alarm sooner. So almost kind of pointing at them that it was their fault, but the scientists are not communicator, they're scientists. They do their job, and they publish their finding, and then it's somebody else's job to communicate that. And that's the missing part, where the artist is actually doing creatively, creating a bridge between the finding of the science and the communication part. And that's where actually we come in to try to leverage that work and bring it to people and communicate that.
So I would argue that like we need both, really all, like this needs to be an and conversation, right? Not an either or, which is like some of the scientists I know are some of the most beautiful communicators on the issues to which they care deeply about, right? And can be incredible spokespeople for them and have been. I think what I hear from Elena is like, we have somehow lost a great deal of trust in quote unquote science in a way in our country that I think is, it's breaking us in a lot of respects, right? Because in the lack of trust around science, then we can't make decisions that actually protect or save or help people, right? But for some reason, we've created some cognitive dissonance around like science as a tool to inform people to make good decisions. Like we've lost that cognitive like connection. But I think that actually art, you're right, and Pino's like, an art can be a bridge to help put those things, I think, back together, right? Which is art makes us look at ourselves as humans differently, right? And hopefully through art, both dance, theater, performing art, like all of them, right, can give a perspective into the world and to people to make you think about something fundamentally differently that you've maybe thought about one way all of the time. And can then bring you around to being like, oh, I'd never thought that that was a problem or that was an issue, or I didn't see that, or I didn't see myself in that, or a solution to that. And so I think art, both with, you know, Kyra's opening, et cetera, is like art gives you a moment of saying like, well, what is extinction? And how am I contributing to that? What does that look like for me? And then am I doing this in like an active way or in a passive way? Right? Like, am I just sort of going about my day and thinking like, oh, that was a nifty thing, rather than being like, how do I operationalize that for myself? And that's the thing I think art can help you to start recalibrating, which is, do I just think about this and just do it, rather than like, how do I actually live the value that I care deeply about?
Then I would have to ask Whitney how we make art accessible to everyone. Because art right now, it's in a museum or it's in a Broadway show or an off-Broadway theater or like a Rattlestick. But, you know, our low-income folks, our kids in failing schools, do they have access to that art? You know, it's kept in this silo for people, you know, who have this intellectual interest in art, and it doesn't necessarily filter down and is accessible by everyone who really needs it. You know, back in the Bloomberg administration, when they were developing, you know, the Hudson River Park and, you know, the Harlem Piers Park or Harlem Piers waterfront was a parking lot for Fairway. And, you know, I thought, well, how do our kids and families have a sense of aesthetics, have a sense of natural beauty? And we've got a parking lot, but everybody else has this beautiful esplanade and park. And so we were able to come together as a community and then hold government accountable. And the city decided to build the park, you know, in the image of that the community had come together and wanted. And so again, making aesthetics and art accessible to everyone is really, really important. It just can't be just for the elite or the, you know, intellectual class, so to speak.
We had a really wonderful conversation 2 weeks ago where Daniela brought together for Rattlestick and a group of 5 or 6 small theater organizations, some of which you've heard of and some of which you wouldn't have heard of. And that was the whole conversation around what theater and playwrights and storytellers in general need to do and are doing by taking theater to communities, going out of the box. One theater in Brooklyn had taken their costume designers and had made masks to keep them busy and to let them express their creative freedom. And they rode around bicycles delivering masks to at-risk communities. It was across the board, to your point around the power of art to heal and to inspire and to express, that requires it to be available to everyone, and which is, on behalf of Rattlestick, why we're having these conversations, and why Rattlestick, as in the role I play, applaud the Rattlestick team in how they create community conversations. They work with community organizations to include their representation in the playwrights' work. They engage small groups, large groups across the city to make sure that the stories are being heard, and the like. I did not intend this to be a Rattlestick advertisement, but there are lots of communities that are doing exactly this because they need to. And it's interesting to watch that, fortunately or unfortunately, because a lot of art happens to be in boxes these days, that in most cases, art will not be restored until phase 4 of reopening. And then, so we're trying to find new ways, like on this Zoom, and what Pino's doing, what you're all doing, and other conversations around to harness that and to take the inspiration and the like to bring it out, because like everything else, it's got to be part of the process, because that's how people express themselves and emote and.
And you know, I would hope that maybe more Broadway theater, because we don't know how long it's going to be before we go back in those little seats. It would be great if more could be on television, even if it's pay-per-view. The whole world could have more access to theater, even if it's not live necessarily, but it's a way to really broaden theater. And the Hamilton show, you know, being able to be on Disney is going to open that show up to so many people who could never be able to go. My husband took me for my birthday and I was stunned. I got out of the cab and looked up at the marquee and it said Hamilton. I was like, oh my God, you got a ticket. But, you know, to be able to see some more Broadway and theater on television, even if you have to pay small amounts, it would make it up in the masses of people who could access it. So I just hope that we'll see more theater on television, not just at Christmas time, you know, when you see the ballet or something.
Yeah, it was really fun to watch Alvin Ailey put on a lot of their original, what I consider iconic works on YouTube for free early on in COVID. And I don't know how many people saw that, but watching a lot of companies who have that sort of historical catalog give it for free, especially right now, but also to whom, to get to your point, Peggy, like who has access to that, who even knows about it, like who can see it, to really publish that really broadly so that like every child who sits in New York City could have watched, you know, some of those classic pieces. And I literally sat down and had my children watch it and they were like blown away, right? Because I haven't taken them yet. They're still kind of young, but to sit in the comfort of our home for them to watch, it was mind-boggling for our 5-year-old to be like, people do this for a living. It's like, yes, they do. And that's what mom used to do. You just don't know that because I'm older now.
And there's even, I don't know if anybody has seen Pina, but it's a 3D dance film that came out in 2011. And it actually takes you into the middle of the dance in a way that it, like, you don't even experience in the theater. And so there's actually, I think, ways to take it to a whole different level that you sometimes can't when you're back in the seats.
There's a question from the Zoom audience, which follows up this very nicely, in that we've been talking about what COVID is going to teach us about the environment and our last best chance to deal with something or attack something. They're asking, as artists, how can they work within their last best chance to help? What are ways for artists to stay consistently involved in this fight? How can you help? How can they help the collective us have this conversation?
Really good question. I wish I knew the answer. I mean, I feel like in a way, I feel like, in some ways it's about marketing, it's about really getting this word out. I mean, I feel like, yes, art, of course, art, but I also just feel like in some ways, the messaging of the pro fossil fuel industry and the way they've been able to disseminate disinformation is just more genius than ever. So if there are any great artists out there who have any great marketing skills also, and can come up with something that's, great for Madison Avenue, I think that would be great too. But of course, doing your art and making it socially relevant is always worthwhile, and ways to get it out there now. I mean, in some ways it's more accessible than ever. I love Pino's idea of I can't imagine that people aren't going to just spontaneously start, doing stuff on the street. And I think that, if there's a way to capture this moment of, what we're talking about with race and what we're talking about with environment and what we're talking about with COVID and what we're talking about disparity, economic disparity, if we can talk about all of it in an artistic way and get people thinking about it. I mean, nothing is better than that. And as Whitney said, nothing is more touching than to be touched for art to touch you in a way that makes you think differently about things.
Yeah, I would also like us to think about partnerships. For instance, I've been in community academic partnerships with Columbia School of Public Health for over 20 years. And our job is to translate the research into policy. And so if artists or art groups were to partner with other kinds of organizations, maybe a social justice organization, they could take and translate some of that work into an artistic expression. And so I think with stronger collaborations, that we could do more of that, and it could be more explicit and more intentional.
One more question from the audience, from Jody. How can street equity be part of the solution for restoring vibrancy to the city for the COVID recovery, and also part of the work we need to do for climate resiliency? It seems like New York City has already slipped into financial hardship. How can we move forward with this important work in light of impending financial distress?
So it's an interesting question, because there certainly are budget realities in the near term for big investments. But I think what we've seen over the past, as bike lanes and pedestrian plazas and other things started to take over different parts of the city, really over the past decade, it doesn't take that much money. It takes some paint, or it might take some bollards or barriers at first. I think there's so many creative things that can be done to make sure that our streets are working better for more people. And, even in our OneNYC program, when we released it last April, making, commitments on expanding how we use delivery space on our streets, and how we can continue to expand out bike lanes. And there's been more recent city council legislation to expand out the bike network. All of that is, I think, just so important to just rethink how our street and public realm are part of serving the livability of our city. And it's not always easy, and there's always fights over parking in different communities and things like that. But I think we just need to continue to work through that and keep pushing for those kinds of solutions.
With that, Dan, I would like to summarize just one quick thing, which was a word that kept coming up repeatedly, was trust. And in the hands of you, Kyra, and Peggy, and Dan, and Elena, and Whitney, and Pino, we as an audience can trust that we are doing more of the right things and will continue to do so. But let us help you continue on your job. And as Kyra's reading from Miranda's beautiful play, it's applause. Thank you, everybody, for participating here. We could go on for hours with such brilliant people, and we should, because there's so much more to talk about. But at this moment, thank you, thank you, thank you.